Okay, let's work on problem 614. This is an analysis and comparison of conservative and aggressive financing ideas and financing alternatives. And I've already sort of laid out my spreadsheet so that it makes it a little bit easier for me to enter everything relatively quickly and keep it in some order so that we can kind of follow it as well. So Guardian Incorporated is trying to develop an asset financing plan. The firm has $400,000 in temporary current assets. All right, so we'll go ahead and put that in here, 400. It's trying to develop a financing plan to finance its asset base, so that we need to know the total assets that this organization has to finance. 300,000 in permanent current assets. Guardian also has 500,000 in fixed assets, which would make its total asset base 1,200,000. All right. Now we have to assume a tax rate of 40%. That'll come into play when we're comparing the two to see what the bottom net income effect is. Construct two alternative financing plans for Guardian, letter A. One of the plans should be conservative, with 75% of the assets that we just calculated, the total asset base, financed by long-term sources, and the other should be aggressive, with only 56.25% of assets financed by long-term sources. The current interest rate is 15% for long-term funds and 10% for short-term financing. So the conservative financing plan is 75% of the assets financed by long-term sources. So under the conservative plan, of the 1.2 million in assets, okay, 75%, so this is 75% of the total of that number will be financed by long-term sources, and we're given the current interest rate is 15% on long-term funds, so it's going to be financed at 15%, and that means the remainder will be financed, which is 25%, right? Because we need 100% of our assets financed. Will be financed using, let's see, short-term financing, which is at 10%. So now we can calculate our interest expense based on this financing alternative. So let's go ahead and multiply that number, 1,200,000 by 75% and by 15%, and that will give us our interest expense for that portion of our total asset base. And we'll do the same thing for the remainder here. Whoops. Try again. The 11 times 25% of that number will be financed at 10%. All right, so our total interest expense under the conservative approach is $165,000. Now under the aggressive approach, it looks like only 56.25% of assets will be financed by long-term sources. So again, our total asset base is 1,200,000 for both options, and we're going to only finance here 56.25% of our total asset base with long-term sources, so that's at 15%. And that means the remainder, which is going to be this number, well, let's see, it will be 1 minus this number. No, that's not going to work. Yeah, it's going to be, let's just do it in our heads. That'll be the easiest. 43.75. So 43.75% of that asset base will be financed with short-term funds. So let's go ahead and do the same calculations. In fact, what I can do is copy these formulas and paste them here. And I get $153,750. So under the conservative approach, that gets us letter A complete here. And it looks like under the conservative approach, if I were to be conservative in this estimate, our interest expense is higher than the aggressive approach at this point. So given that Guardian's earnings before interest and taxes are $200,000, let's calculate earnings after taxes for each of our alternatives. So we're given earnings before interest and taxes, that's EBIT, of $200,000 for both the conservative and aggressive. Obviously it's going to be the same. Then our interest expense under the conservative method was $165,000. And interest expense under the aggressive program was $153,750. That leaves us with earnings before taxes of $200,000 minus our interest expense for each. Alright, you can see that as we would expect, the aggressive approach yields a little bit higher earnings before taxes. Now our tax rate is 40%, so we have to keep that in mind. 40% of this number is how much that we will owe in taxes. And that means earnings after taxes will be earnings before taxes minus our tax amount for each. Alright, so the aggressive approach actually gives us a little bit more income, doesn't it? Earnings after taxes. It looks like about $6,750 more. So we would choose at this point the aggressive. It looks like the aggressive approach over the conservative approach. Now letter C says, what would happen if the short and long-term rates were reversed? Now the nice thing about our spreadsheet here is we could easily make that change right up here. So what it's saying is under letter C, what would happen if the short and long-term rates, these two rates here, were reversed? So in other words, this becomes 10% and this becomes 15% for both programs, 10% and 15%. And you can see what happens, right, to our earnings after taxes. Now all of a sudden the conservative approach looks much more attractive than the aggressive approach. Okay, that's what happens when those interest rates are reversed, and of course that's what we would have expected anyway. You can see what happens again when we put those back where they were. And the aggressive approach looks more attractive than the conservative approach under our original plan. So interest rates, long-term and short-term interest rates, can have a profound effect on the direction you take in your financing plans for a company.